The kitchen at Ravenswood Manor was never empty before midnight. There were always coals left glowing in the hearth, always the smell of yesterday's bread hanging in the cold air, always the soft creak of the old house settling into itself. The cook knew this. The scullery maids knew this. And now so did Cecily Ashworth. She had counted on the darkness. She had counted on the silence. She had not counted on the man standing in the doorway with a candle in one hand and absolutely no expression on his face. He was tall, he was still, and he was watching her with the kind of patience that suggested he had all the time in the world and intended to use every second of it. Cecily did not run. There was nowhere to run. The sack in her hands held 3 loaves of bread and a small wedge of hard cheese, and she was standing in the middle of his kitchen floor like a portrait of guilt. She lifted her chin anyway. "Your Grace," she said, because she recognized him. God help her. She recognized him. And if this was to be her last moment of dignity, she intended to keep her voice steady through it. The Duke of Ravenswood looked at the sack, then at her face, then at the sack again. "You have remarkably calm eyes," he said, "for a thief." Cecily said nothing. He took one slow step into the room, then another. He set the candle on the table between them and looked at her the way a man looks at a puzzle he is not yet sure is worth solving. "The silver is in the east wing," he said. "The wine cellar is 2 floors down. If you came all this way for bread, I find myself wondering why." She did not answer that either. And that silence was what made him look at her differently, not with anger, not with contempt, with something far more dangerous. Curiosity. She had not planned to be caught. She had in fact planned this rather carefully, or as carefully as a woman with no money, no allies, and no good options could plan anything. She had watched the manor from the tree line for 2 evenings. She had noted when the last kitchen light went out. She had waited an extra hour just to be certain. What she had not accounted for was a duke who apparently did not sleep. His name was Edmund Ashford, the Duke of Ravenswood, and his reputation in the county was one of cold efficiency. He had inherited a fortune and multiplied it. He had inherited land, including, as of 14 months ago, the land that had once belonged to her family, and he managed it with the kind of detached precision that left no room for sentiment. People respected him. Some feared him. None of them, as far as Cecily knew, had ever seen him standing in his own kitchen at past midnight in his shirt sleeves. She had seen him once before from a distance at a church service 2 years ago. She had not thought of him since. She was thinking of him very much now. "I would like to leave," she said. "I imagine you would." He did not move from the doorway. "Who are you?" A simple question, a devastating one. Because the answer was this. She was Cecily Ashworth, daughter of the late Baron Ashworth, whose debts had consumed his estate, whose lands had been sold off piece by piece after his death, and whose remaining tenants, 8 families who had farmed the Ashworth fields for generations, now lived on what had become Ravenswood land, in cottages that belonged to the man in front of her. And those families were hungry. The winter had been long. The last harvest had been poor. The Duke's steward had collected the rents without exception and delivered no provisions in return. Cecily had tried to buy bread in the village. She had tried twice with the last coin she had. The baker was sorry, he had said. He had his own family to feed. He was sorry. She had walked 4 miles in the dark instead. She could say none of this. If she gave him her name, he would know her father's name, and he would know the debts, and he would look at her the way everyone looked at her now, with that particular mixture of pity and relief that meant "thank God that is not me." And she would rather be arrested for theft than endure that look from a man like this. "My name is not your concern," she said. Something moved in his expression, not quite amusement, something colder than amusement and more complicated. "You are on my property," he said, "in my kitchen, with my bread. I think you will find that most things about you are currently my concern. Then call for your footman and be done with it." He did not call for the footman. He pulled out a chair from the kitchen table unhurriedly, as though he had decided they had time for this, and sat down. He folded his arms. He looked at her with those unreadable gray eyes, and he simply waited. Cecily had dealt with difficult men before. Her father had been a difficult man in his own gentle, catastrophic way. The solicitors who had come after his death had been difficult men. The neighbors who had stopped returning her calls had been, in their own cowardly fashion, difficult men. She had learned that waiting them out rarely worked, but she had nothing left to offer except silence, so she kept it. "The bread," the Duke said finally. "You took 3 loaves." "I did." "You do not look like a woman who eats 3 loaves of bread in an evening." She said nothing. He tilted his head slightly. "The Mercer family," he said, "in the old North Cottage. Their youngest child has been ill." Cecily went very still. "And the Holt family lost most of their stores to damp in November," he continued, in the same even tone. "And old William Price lives alone, and his hands shake too badly now to manage a proper fire." He paused. "I do read my steward's reports, miss, whoever you are. I simply have not yet decided what to do about what they contain." The silence that followed was different from the ones before it. Cecily looked at him. He looked at her. And for a moment neither of them was a thief or a duke or a ruined baron's daughter. They were just 2 people in a cold kitchen at midnight, and something in the air between them was being quietly, irreversibly rearranged. "They are hungry now," she said. "Not next quarter now." "Yes," he said, "I know." "Then why?" "Because," he said, and for the first time something sharp entered his voice, something that was almost, not quite, but almost directed at himself rather than her. "I have been managing an estate from a desk in London for the better part of a year, and I have been trusting men I perhaps should not have trusted." He stood, he crossed to the larder. He opened it, looked at the contents for a moment, and then he turned back to her. "Take what you need," he said. Cecily stared at him. "For the families," he said, as though she might have misunderstood. "Take what they need for the week. I will speak to my steward in the morning." She did not move immediately. She was waiting for the condition. There was always a condition. "And in return?" she asked. He looked genuinely surprised by the question. Then something settled in his face, not warmth, not quite, but the distant relative of it. "In return," he said, "you will tell me your name." Cecily picked up her sack. She added to it carefully, practically without greed, enough for 8 families for a week. She tied it. She lifted it. At the kitchen door she stopped. "Cecily," she said, and then, because she was her father's daughter after all and some habits could not be unlearned, "Good evening, Your Grace." She walked out into the dark. Behind her she heard him say her name once, quietly, to himself, the way a man repeats a word he intends to remember. She did not look back. The morning after a sleepless night had a particular quality that Cecily had come to know well. It was not the tiredness. She was used to tiredness. It was the way the light came in too bright and too indifferent, the way ordinary things, a cracked cup, a cold hearth, the sound of wind under the door, seemed to ask questions she did not have answers to. She had delivered the food before dawn. She had knocked on the Mercer cottage first, left the bread on the step, knocked twice, and walked away before anyone could open the door. She did not want thanks. Thanks required a face, and a face required an explanation, and she was not ready to explain to anyone why she had spent the previous hour in a duke's kitchen being looked at like that. Like what exactly she could not say. She told herself it did not matter. She told herself she would not think about it. By noon she had thought about it 11 times. The letter arrived 3 days later. It was not addressed to her. It was addressed to Mrs. Holt, whose eldest daughter could read, and who brought it to Cecily with a look of cautious bewilderment that Cecily was beginning to recognize as the expression people wore when something good happened, and they did not yet trust it. The Duke of Ravenswood, the letter stated, had reviewed the provisioning arrangements for the North Estate tenants and found them to be inadequate. Effective immediately, a weekly provision of staple goods would be delivered each Monday morning. Furthermore, outstanding rent balances accrued during the winter months of hardship were to be forgiven in full. Mrs. Holt sat down heavily in her chair when her daughter finished reading. "He did that," she said, not a question, a bewildered statement of fact. "It appears so," Cecily said. Mrs. Holt looked at her. "Did you speak to him?" "I have never met the Duke of Ravenswood," Cecily said, which was almost entirely untrue and completely necessary. She folded the letter carefully and set it back on the table and did not think about gray eyes and a cold kitchen, and a man who had said *I know in a voice that sounded, underneath its surface, like an admission. The position was advertised in the county paper on a Thursday. Lady Pemworth, elderly, sharp-tongued, recently relocated from Bath for reasons no one had fully explained, required a governess companion for her great-niece, aged 9, who had recently come into her care. The child was, the advertisement noted with unusual candor, spirited asterisk. The successful candidate would be educated, patient, and possessed of a steady temperament. Cecily read the advertisement 4 times. She had been a baron's daughter. She had had her own governess, her own music tutor, her own carefully ordered girlhood in a house that had smelled of beeswax and old books. She had spoken French before she spoke proper sentences. She had learned to play the pianoforte at 4 years old and watercolor at 6, and the particular art of entering a room correctly at 8. She had never, in any version of the future she had imagined for herself, expected those skills to become her livelihood. But the coins in her drawer were almost gone. The option of pride had quietly expired sometime in November. She wrote the letter as Miss Clare. It was her mother's maiden name, and it felt less like a lie than a borrowing, something taken temporarily, with the intention of returning it when she no longer needed it quite so badly. Lady Pemworth's house was not large, but it was warm, and it smelled of dog and dried lavender, and the very specific kind of comfortable disorder that belongs to women who stopped caring about other people's opinions sometime in their 60s and never looked back. The great-niece, whose name was Harriet, looked at Cecily from across the parlor with the focused suspicion of a child who had seen several governesses come and go and had opinions about all of them. "Can you ride?" Harriet asked before Cecily had fully sat down. "Yes," Cecily said. "My last governess couldn't ride. She was frightened of the gray mare and cried about it." "I am not frightened of gray mares." Harriet considered this. "Can you climb a tree?" "Harriet," Lady Pemworth said, without looking up from her embroidery. "It's a reasonable question," Harriet said. "I can climb a tree," Cecily said, "though I would prefer not to make a habit of it." Harriet smiled for the first time. It transformed her entirely. She went from watchful to radiant in the space of a second, and Cecily felt something in her chest shift unexpectedly. Lady Pemworth finally looked up. She had sharp blue eyes that had clearly seen a great deal and forgotten very little. She studied Cecily for a long moment, the kind of look that went past the surface of things and took stock of what was underneath. "You are educated," she said. It was not a question. "Yes, my lady." "More than your letter suggested." Cecily met her gaze. "I tried not to seem overqualified." Lady Pemworth made a sound that might, in a less dignified woman, have been a snort. "My nephew will want to meet you," she said. He takes an interest in my household arrangements, interfering boy. She said this with complete and obvious affection. He will be here Thursday for dinner. You will join us. Of course, Cecily said. She did not yet know who Lady Pemworth's nephew was. She found out on Wednesday evening from Harriet, who delivered the information with the cheerful casualness of someone dropping a lit match. My great-aunt's nephew is coming tomorrow, Harriet said, not looking up from the arithmetic problem Cecily had set her. Uncle Edmund, he's a duke. He's very serious, but he always brings me books so I don't mind. Cecily's pen stopped moving. Uncle Edmund, she repeated. The Duke of Ravenswood. Harriet finally looked up. Do you know him? No, Cecily said. I don't believe I do. She looked down at the page in front of her. The words had stopped making sense. The numbers, too. Edmund Ashford, the Duke of Ravenswood. The man in the kitchen. The man with the candle and the gray eyes and the voice that had said take what you need as though it were a simple thing. The man who had looked at her in the dark and repeated her name to himself like a word worth keeping. He would walk through that door tomorrow and he would look at her, and it would be over. Unless it wasn't. It had been dark in the kitchen. She had been in her cloak. He had seen her face, yes, but briefly by candlelight, and people saw what they expected to see. A governess in a governess's house was a governess. A thief in a kitchen was a thief. The same face in different circumstances was, more often than not, simply a different face. She had one evening to decide. Run or stay. She was standing by the parlor window when his carriage came up the drive on Thursday. She watched him step down, tall, dark-coated, moving with that particular economy of motion that she remembered from the kitchen, nothing wasted, nothing performed. He glanced up at the house with the expression of a man who was already thinking about something else. Then, for just a moment, his gaze moved to the window. Cecily did not step back. She stood very still and let him look, because stepping back would mean she was hiding, and she had decided, sometime in the long, quiet hours of the night before, that she was done hiding. She was Miss Clare, governess, and she had done nothing wrong, and if he recognized her then she would face it standing up. He looked at the window for 2 seconds. Then he looked away and walked through the front door, and the moment passed. Cecily let out a breath she had been holding since Wednesday. Dinner was the longest meal of her life. Lady Pemworth sat at the head of the table. Harriet sat beside her great-aunt and ate with slightly more decorum than usual, which suggested she was performing for an audience. The Duke sat across from Cecily, and he was polite, and he was correct, and he spoke to his aunt about estate matters and to Harriet about her lessons and to Cecily about nothing. He addressed her exactly once, to ask whether Harriet had made progress with her French. Considerable progress, Cecily said. She has a natural ear for it. Miss Clare is very good, Harriet said loyally. She doesn't make faces when I get it wrong. The Duke looked at Cecily then, a brief, direct look, the kind that took inventory. High praise, he said, and his voice was perfectly neutral, and his eyes gave nothing away, and Cecily could absolutely not tell whether he knew. She smiled pleasantly and looked down at her soup. Across the table, the Duke of Ravenswood picked up his spoon and said nothing more. After dinner, while Lady Pemworth dozed by the fire and Harriet had been sent to bed, Cecily stood in the hallway putting on her shawl to go up to her room. She heard him before she saw him. Miss Clare. She turned. He was standing at the end of the hall, coat on, gloves in hand, ready to leave. He looked at her with those gray eyes that she was beginning to think never showed anything he did not intend them to show. Your French, he said, is excellent. A pause. For a governess. He put on his gloves. He walked to the door. He left. and Cecily stood in the hallway for a long time afterward, her shawl half on and her heart beating very quickly, trying to decide what that meant. She could not decide. That, she thought, was probably the point. The library at Lady Pemworth's house was small and slightly damp, and nobody used it except Cecily. This was, she had decided, one of the few genuine advantages of her current situation. The books were old and the chairs were uncomfortable, and the window faced north, which meant the light was never quite right. But it was quiet, and it was private, and on the evenings when Harriet was asleep and Lady Pemworth had retired and the house had settled into itself, Cecily could sit at the small desk in the corner and work. Work was perhaps too dignified a word for what she was doing. What she was doing was trying to prove that her father had been robbed. It had started 2 years ago, in the weeks after her father's death, when the solicitors had arrived with their papers and their patient, practiced expressions and their columns of numbers that did not, no matter how many times Cecily checked them, seem to add up correctly. Baron Ashworth had owed debts. This was not in dispute. He had been a gentle man and a poor manager, and he had trusted people he should not have trusted, which was a failing Cecily had spent considerable time being furious at him for, particularly in the months after she had nothing left to eat except that fury. But the number the solicitors presented, the total sum, the final accounting, had been wrong. She had known it in the way you know something before you can prove it, the way a wrong note sounds wrong even before you can name the key. The figure was too large. The interest was too high. There were fees she did not recognize attached to transactions she could not find records of. She had said so once to the lead solicitor, a man named Grantham, smooth and well-dressed and faintly amused by her. He had explained, very kindly, that grief sometimes made it difficult to process complex financial matters. She had thanked him. She had shown him out. And then she had sat down and begun, methodically and with cold determination, to learn everything she could about her father's finances. The problem was that most of the documents were gone. Grantham had taken them, for safekeeping, he had said, for the purposes of the estate settlement. She had signed something. She had signed too many things in those first terrible weeks, when she had still believed that solicitors were trustworthy, and that the law protected people like her. And now the documents were in Grantham's office in London, and she had no money for a lawyer and no brother to act on her behalf, and no husband to stand between her and the smooth, patient men who were dismantling her life piece by piece. What she had was memory and stubbornness, and the small collection of papers her father had kept separately from the main accounts, personal correspondence, old receipts, a leather notebook in which he had recorded, in his cramped and anxious handwriting, his version of every significant transaction he had ever made. She had memorized most of it. She was looking now for the gaps, the places where her father's records and Grantham's accounting diverged. Because they did diverge, she was increasingly certain of it, and the divergence pointed always in the same direction. Toward a debt that had been owed not to Grantham, but to the previous Duke of Ravenswood. And then somehow had grown. The problem with libraries in other people's houses was that they contained other people's books. Lady Pemworth's collection ran heavily to novels and travel memoirs, and a complete set of botanical illustrations that Harriet had been forbidden to touch after an incident involving watercolors that no one would fully explain. There was very little of practical use to Cecily. What she needed was access to the Ravenswood estate records. She thought about this for 2 weeks before she admitted to herself what she was actually considering. Then she thought about it for another week, because she was not, in spite of recent evidence, a reckless person. Then the Duke came to dinner again. He came every Thursday. This apparently was a long-standing arrangement, Lady Pemworth was his mother's eldest sister, and he was, beneath the considerable frost of his public manner, genuinely devoted to her. He sat with her after dinner while Harriet was put to bed. He listened to her talk. He did not check his watch. Cecily observed this from a careful distance and tried not to find it affecting. She did not entirely succeed. He was not what she had expected in the weeks since that first dinner. She had expected cold. She had expected the detached efficiency she had heard described. And he was those things in company, in conversation with people he did not know. He was polished and remote in the way of a man who had learned very early that warmth was a resource to be conserved. But with Lady Pemworth he was different. And with Harriet, who had decided to adore him, as children sometimes decided things, completely and without reservation, he was different still. He brought her books, as promised. He asked about her lessons with the seriousness of someone who considered the question genuinely important. When Harriet showed him the watercolor she had done of the garden, he looked at it for a long time and said it was very good, and he said it in a tone that suggested he meant it rather than simply that he had said it. Cecily watched all of this and thought, this is a man who was told, at some point, that the world required a particular version of him, and who has been performing that version for so long he has half forgotten there are others. She knew something about that. She did not allow herself to think about it further. It was Harriet who gave her the opening. "Uncle Edmund," Harriet said, on the fourth Thursday, with the focused purposefulness of a 9-year-old who had been planning something, "Miss Clare needs to visit your library." Cecily looked up from her embroidery. The Duke looked up from his book. "Does she?" he said. It was not quite a question. "Lady Pemworth's library doesn't have anything useful," Harriet continued. "Miss Clare is teaching me history, and she says the reference books here are very out of date." Both statements were true. Neither was the reason Cecily wanted access to the Ravenswood library, and she had absolutely not asked Harriet to say any of this. "Harriet," she said carefully. "It's a reasonable request," Harriet said, with the satisfaction of someone who had borrowed an argument that had previously been used against her and was now deploying it effectively. The Duke looked at Cecily. She met his gaze with what she hoped was an expression of mild professional interest rather than the particular combination of guilt and desperate calculation that she was actually feeling. "Miss Clare is welcome to make use of the library at Ravenswood," he said. "I will let the housekeeper know." "Thank you, Your Grace," Cecily said. "Thursday afternoons would be convenient," he said, "when I am in residence." A pause. "So that someone can assist you in locating what you need," he added. "Of course," she said. He went back to his book. Cecily went back to her embroidery and did not look up for the rest of the evening. The Ravenswood Library was everything Lady Pemworth's was not. It was large and warm and smelled of leather and wood smoke, and the very specific gravity of a room that had been taken seriously for generations. The shelves ran floor to ceiling on 3 walls. There was a rolling ladder. There were reading tables with proper lamps. There were globes and maps and busts of serious-looking men who appeared to disapprove of everything, which Cecily found oddly comforting. The housekeeper showed her in on a Tuesday. The Duke was in London, she said, but had left instructions, and Cecily stood in the middle of the room for a moment and breathed. Then she went to work. She was not looking for the estate records on the first visit. On the first visit she found the history books she had told Harriet she needed, because she was not a liar. She was a woman managing several layers of truth simultaneously, which was a different thing. She made notes. She selected 3 volumes to borrow. She was perfectly well behaved. On the second visit, she found the section of estate records. They were not hidden. They were simply shelved at the far end of the room in the orderly, unremarkable way of documents that no one expects anyone to be interested in ledgers and correspondence organized by year, going back 4 decades, the administrative skeleton of a large estate. She stood in front of them for a long time. Then she pulled out the volume for 1809, the year her father's debt had been first recorded, and sat down at the reading table. It was all there. Not the fraud, not yet, not in this volume, but the original transaction. Her father's debt to the previous duke, recorded in a different hand than Grantham's, different numbers, different terms. Smaller, more reasonable. The kind of debt a man like her father might genuinely have incurred and might genuinely have managed, given time. She found 1811, 1812, the debt growing but slowly at the rate specified in the original agreement. She found 1815, the year the previous duke had died. And then she found 1816, in a new hand, a crisper, more contemporary script, and the number was different. Not larger by interest, not larger by any logic she could follow. Larger by a sum that corresponded, almost exactly, to the value of the Ashworth North Fields. Her hands were very steady. She was proud of them for that. She was still sitting at the table with the ledger open in front of her when she heard the door. She did not need to look up to know who it was. The quality of the silence changed when he entered a room, or perhaps she had simply learned in the past weeks to recognize the particular way he moved through the world, which was a thing she refused to examine too closely. "Miss Clare." His voice was carefully neutral, the kind of neutral that meant something. She looked up. He was standing just inside the door, coat still on, gloves in hand. He had come from somewhere, or was going somewhere, or had perhaps specifically come here because he had been told she was here and had wanted to see what she was doing. She could not tell which. His eyes went to the ledger on the table, then to her face. "You are not reading about the history of the Napoleonic Wars," he said. "No," she said, "I am not." "What are you reading?" She could lie. She had become rather good at lies of omission, at half-truths shaped to fit uncomfortable spaces. She could say she had simply been curious about the estate's history, or that she had taken the wrong volume by mistake, or any number of things that were technically not untrue. She looked at him instead, at the gray eyes and the careful face, and the man underneath the Duke who brought his Aunt Lavender biscuits from Bath, because she had once mentioned she liked them, and she made a decision. "I am reading the 1816 estate accounts," she said. "Specifically, the record of a debt originally owed by my father to your father." The silence that followed had a very particular texture. "Your father," he said. "Baron Ashworth," she watched his face. "Yes." He was still for a moment that stretched considerably longer than a moment. Then he closed the library door behind him. He crossed the room. He stood on the other side of the reading table and looked down at the ledger. She turned it so he could see. "This is the original figure," she said, pointing. "Recorded in your father's hand or his secretary's in 1809. This is the figure as it stood in 1815, the year your father died." She moved her finger. "And this is the figure recorded in 1816, after Mr. Grantham took over the management of the debt." He looked at the numbers. He was quiet for a long time. "The difference," he said, "is not accounted for by interest," she said, "or by any additional borrowing I can find record of. The difference corresponds very closely to the assessed value of my family's North Fields at the time of the estate settlement." He looked up from the ledger. She met his eyes. "I am not a thief, Your Grace," she said, and her voice was steady, steadier than she had expected it to be, steadier than she felt. "My father was not a dishonest man. He was a careless man and a trusting man, and he died believing he had ruined us, and I have spent 2 years trying to understand whether that was true." She paused. I do not think it was entirely true." The Duke looked at her for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was different than she had ever heard it. Not softer, exactly. More careful. The way a man speaks when he is choosing his words because the wrong ones would be a small violence. "How long have you known about this?" "Since shortly after my father died. I have been looking for the records for 2 years." "And you came to this house, to this position." "I needed work," she said. "That part is true. I needed work and the position was available and I took it." She held his gaze. "I did not plan to find this. I did not know your estate records would be accessible to me. I came here because I had no other option and I stayed because—" She stopped. "Because," he said. "Because Harriet had smiled at her on the second day, and Lady Pemworth had said you'll do in a tone that felt, inexplicably, like being welcomed. Because the house was warm and she had been cold for a very long time. Because on Thursday evenings, a man sat across a dinner table from her and looked at her as though she were a problem worth the effort of solving, and she had forgotten what it felt like to be looked at that way. Because I am good at the work," she said. He looked at her for another long moment. Then he looked down at the ledger again. "Grantham," he said, very quietly. "Yes." "He managed the transition after my father died. He was recommended by the family solicitors." A pause. "He is currently managing 3 other estate accounts for families in this county." Cecily had not known that. She felt something cold move through her. "How many of those families," she said slowly, "have lost land in the past 10 years?" He did not answer immediately. Which was, she realized, itself an answer. He straightened. He stepped back from the table. He looked at her with an expression she could not entirely read, something complicated moving underneath the surface of it, something that was partly anger and was partly, she thought, directed entirely at himself. "Miss Clare," he said. "Yes." "What is your name, your actual name?" A pause. "You already know," she said. He had known since the hallway, she thought. Perhaps since the first Thursday dinner. Perhaps since the moment he had walked into the library and seen her at that particular table with that particular ledger and understood, in the way intelligent people understood things before they were ready to admit it, exactly who she was and what she was looking for. "Cecily Ashworth," he said, not a question. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment that seemed to fill the entire room. "I owe you an apology," he said. She had not expected that. She had expected anger at the deception, at the name, at the complication of it. She had prepared herself for anger. She had not prepared herself for his voice in that register, the one that had no performance in it at all. "You owe me rather more than that," she said. And then, because she was not entirely without mercy, "But it is a reasonable place to start." He looked at her then, really looked at her, the way he had in the kitchen on that first night, like a puzzle he was not sure was worth solving and was becoming increasingly certain was. "I will look into Grantham," he said. "I will find out what was done and by whom, and I will," he stopped, started again. "I will fix it, whatever can be fixed." "I know you will," she said. He looked at her sharply. "You sound very certain of that," he said, "for a woman who has had very little reason to trust men who make promises." "I am not certain," she said. "I am choosing to believe it. There is a difference." The library was very quiet. Outside, somewhere in the house, Harriet was practicing her scales on the old parlor piano, hitting the same wrong note she always hit in the third measure, and correcting it with a small, audible sound of frustration. The Duke of Ravenswood looked at Cecily Ashworth across a reading table covered in the evidence of a decade of quiet fraud, and something in his face shifted, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way of something that has been held in place for a long time beginning, very carefully, to let go. "Stay," he said, "in the position. While I investigate, I would a pause. It would be useful to have you here." Cecily looked at him for a long moment. "I was not planning to leave," she said. The invitation arrived on a Monday. It was addressed to Lady Pemworth, which was correct, and it requested the pleasure of her company and that of her household at the Ravenswood Winter Ball, which was held every year on the last Friday of December, and which was, by all accounts, the social event of the county. Lady Pemworth read it at breakfast, set it down beside her tea, and looked at Cecily over the rim of her cup. "You will come," she said. "I am the governess," Cecily said. "You are my companion," Lady Pemworth said, with the particular firmness of a woman who had spent 80 years saying things once and expecting them to be heard. "The invitation says household. You are part of this household. You will come." "Lady Pemworth." "Harriet will need someone sensible beside her. She becomes overexcited at parties, and last year she knocked an entire tray of champagne glasses onto Lord Hathwick, which he deserved, but which created a great deal of unnecessary paperwork." She picked up her cup. "You will come. We will not discuss it further." They did not discuss it further. Cecily had one evening dress. She had packed it when she left the Ashworth house, not because she expected to need it, but because it had been her mother's and she could not leave it behind. It was deep green silk, simply cut, without the elaborate ornamentation that was currently fashionable, which meant it was either elegantly understated or hopelessly out of date depending on who was looking at it. She shook it out and hung it by the window and looked at it for a long time. Her mother had worn it to a Christmas ball 20 years ago. There was a small mend at the left cuff, nearly invisible, that Cecily had done herself. The silk still moved well. It was still, she thought, a beautiful dress. She put it on. She looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand, her dark hair pinned up simply, her mother's pearl earrings, the green dress, and she thought, "This is what I have. It will have to be enough." It had always had to be enough. She was rather practiced at it by now. The manor was lit from every window when their carriage came up the drive. Cecily had grown up in a house that had hosted parties, smaller ones, quieter ones, the modest entertainments of a minor baron's household. But she had also, as a girl, attended larger affairs, the kind of evening that existed in memory as a collection of impressions. Candlelight and music and the particular warmth of a room full of people who were all, for one evening, pretending that life was uncomplicated. She had not attended anything like this in 3 years. The entrance hall was full of people she recognized and people who recognized her, which were not always the same people. She saw it happen. The moment a face across the room registered hers, the quick recalibration, the whisper to the person beside them. She kept her chin level and her pace steady and focused on the back of Lady Pemworth's silver head moving through the crowd ahead of her. Harriet, walking beside Cecily with her hand tucked into the crook of her arm, leaned up and whispered, "People keep looking at you." "People look at everyone," Cecily said quietly. "It is what people do at parties." "They're looking at you differently," Harriet said, with the unsettling perceptiveness of children who have been underestimated into paying close attention, like they're trying to remember something. "Then let them remember," Cecily said. "It costs us nothing." Harriet considered this. Then she nodded, with the air of someone filing it away for future use, and tightened her grip on Cecily's arm. The ballroom was enormous and warm and smelled of hothouse flowers and beeswax candles, and the faint undercurrent of too many people in formal clothing being very careful about everything they said. Cecily found a position near the windows, close enough to Lady Pemworth to be useful, far enough from the center of the room to be unobtrusive, and settled into the particular skill she had developed over the past 3 years, which was the skill of being present without being visible. She watched the room. She saw the Duke almost immediately, because he was difficult not to see, tall, dark-coated, moving through the crowd with the ease of a man in his own territory, which he was. He was speaking to a group of older gentlemen near the fireplace, and he was doing the version of himself that she recognized from their early dinners, polished, correct, a little remote. The Duke of Ravenswood in public. He had not seen her yet. Or if he had not shown it. The woman appeared at Cecily's elbow some time during the second set. She was perhaps 50, beautifully dressed, with pale eyes and a smile that was warm in the way of things that have been carefully designed to appear warm. "Miss Ashworth," she said. "Not Miss Clare, Miss Ashworth." Cecily turned slowly. "I'm afraid you have the advantage of me." "The Dowager Duchess of Ravenswood," the woman said. "Edmund's mother." The smile did not waver. "I have been hoping for an opportunity to speak with you." Cecily felt the floor shift slightly beneath her, the way it did when you stepped onto ice and were not entirely certain it would hold. "Your Grace," she said. "I understand you have been very helpful to my sister-in-law," the Dowager said. "Lady Pemworth speaks well of you, and my nephew's ward seems quite devoted." "Harriet is a remarkable child," Cecily said. "Indeed." The Dowager looked at her with those pale eyes that were, Cecily noticed, taking very careful inventory. "I also understand that you have been making use of the Ravenswood Library." A pause. "Your son very kindly offered me access," Cecily said, "for the purposes of Harriet's education." "Of course." Another warm, constructed smile. "I wonder, Miss Ashworth, it is Ashworth, isn't it, not Clare? I wonder if you have given much thought to your position here." "I think about it regularly," Cecily said. "It is an excellent position." "It is a temporary one," the Dowager said, and the warmth in her voice contracted very slightly, like a flower closing at dusk. "My son has obligations, to his name, to this estate, to a future that requires a particular kind of alliance. I'm sure you understand." Cecily looked at her steadily. "I understand a great many things, Your Grace." "I'm certain you do." The Dowager tilted her head. "You are your father's daughter, after all. A man of considerable understanding, from what I recall, who nonetheless found himself in very unfortunate circumstances." It was elegantly done. The reference to her father, his failure, his debts, the ruin that still clung to the Ashworth name like smoke, delivered in a pleasant voice at a party, surrounded by music and candlelight, where Cecily could not respond to it as she wished to. She smiled instead. It cost her something, but she had been paying costs like this for 3 years. She could manage one more. "It was lovely to meet you, Your Grace," she said. She turned back to the window. She was watching Harriet navigate a conversation with 2 older girls, doing admirably, Cecily noted with quiet pride, when she became aware of someone beside her. She did not need to look. "Your mother spoke to me," she said. "I know," the Duke said. "I saw a pause. I apologize." "You cannot apologize for other people." "I can try." He was standing beside her at the window, not quite facing her, both of them looking out at the room. It was, she thought, a very specific kind of conversation, the kind conducted in parallel, where the words went sideways instead of across. "She is not a cruel woman." "No," Cecily agreed. "She is a practical one. There is a difference." He was quiet for a moment. "She has someone in mind," he said. "For me. Miss Hargrove, considerable fortune, agreeable family, entirely suitable in every way that my mother considers relevant." Cecily kept her eyes on Harriet. "That is generally how these things work." "Yes," he said, "it is." Another silence. The music shifted, the end of one set, the beginning of another. "Dance with me," he said. She turned to look at him then, because she could not help it. His expression was not quite readable, it never entirely was, but there was something in it that was asking a different question than the words, something underneath the words that was saying, "I know what this costs. I am asking anyway." "Your Grace," she said carefully. "I am aware of what I am asking," he said. "I am aware of what people will say. I am asking regardless." A pause. "Unless you do not wish to." She thought about the dowager's smile. She thought about 3 years of being careful and quiet and smaller than she was. She thought about her mother's green dress and the pearl earrings, and the mend at the left cuff that was nearly invisible if you did not know where to look. "I wish to," she said. They danced, and the room noticed. She felt it, the shift in the air, the attention gathering like weather, the whispers beginning at the edges and moving inward. She kept her chin level. She kept her eyes on his face, which was easier than she had expected because his face was the steadiest thing in the room. "They are staring," she said quietly. "Let them stare," he said. She almost smiled. "That is my line." Something moved in his expression, something that was close to warmth, closer than she had seen before. "Then we are of the same mind," he said. They moved through the figures of the dance, the turn, the separation, the return, and for the length of one set the room contracted to the space between them, the music, the candlelight on the parquet floor. She did not think about the dowager. She did not think about Grantham or ledgers or the North Fields or the careful architecture of the last 3 years. She thought about nothing except this, the movement, the warmth, the particular and bewildering fact of being here, in this room, in her mother's dress, dancing with the Duke of Ravenswood, who was looking at her as though she were the only fixed point in an otherwise unreliable world. The music ended. He bowed, she curtsied. Around them the room breathed again, the whispers rising. "Thank you," he said, very quietly, just for her. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "Your mother is watching." He did not look away from her face. "I know," he said. "I don't particularly care." She cared the next morning. Not about the dowager exactly, but about what came after, the particular way parties had of creating moments that daylight then had to account for. In the warm dark of a ballroom, everything seemed possible. In the cold gray of a December morning, things resolved back into their actual shapes. She was a governess with a borrowed name and a dead father's debts, and a claim against the estate of the man who had danced with her. He was a duke with a mother, and an estate and obligations she did not pretend to be unaware of. These were the actual shapes. She sat at the small desk in Lady Pemworth's library with Harriet's lesson books open in front of her, and she was very sensible about it, very clear-eyed, very practical. She was almost entirely successful. Then Harriet came in, sat down across from her, looked at her with those unsettlingly perceptive eyes and said, "He looked at you the whole time, even when you weren't dancing, even when he was talking to other people. I watched." Cecily looked at her lesson book. "We are doing mathematics this morning," she said. "I don't like mathematics," Harriet said. "I know," Cecily said. "We are doing it anyway." Harriet opened her book, but she was smiling. And Cecily, looking down at the page in front of her so that no one would see it, was smiling too. Just slightly, just for a moment. Then she composed herself and got on with the mathematics. The letter from London arrived on a Tuesday. The Duke had been gone for 10 days. He had left the morning after the ball business in the city. He had told Lady Pemworth, estate matters requiring his personal attention. He had said goodbye to Harriet, who had accepted this with the philosophical resignation of a child accustomed to adults leaving. He had not said goodbye to Cecily. He had, however, left a note on the library table. 3 lines. His handwriting was very like him, precise, no flourishes, nothing wasted. I have engaged a separate solicitor to review the 1816 accounts. This will take time. In the meantime, please do not do anything I would consider inadvisable. Yar. Cecily had read it twice, folded it and put it in her pocket. She had taken it out and read it twice more before dinner. She was not examining why. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, as she said. It was not addressed to her. It was addressed to Lady Pemworth from the Duke, and Lady Pemworth read it at breakfast and then set it down and looked out the window for a long moment with an expression Cecily could not quite read. Edmund asks that you join him in London, Lady Pemworth said. Cecily set down her teacup. I beg your pardon. He has found something. Lady Pemworth picked up the letter again, scanning it. He does not say what precisely, which is very like him. He has always had a theatrical streak, though he would deny it absolutely. She folded the letter. He says it concerns you directly and that he would prefer to explain it in person rather than in writing. Cecily was quiet for a moment. I cannot go to London, she said. I have no money for the journey and no. He has arranged the journey, Lady Pemworth said. The carriage leaves Thursday morning. Harriet and I will accompany you. I have been meaning to visit my dressmaker for 2 months, and this is as good a reason as any. She poured herself more tea with the air of someone who had resolved the matter entirely. Cecily looked at her. You are very calm about this. I am 81 years old, Lady Pemworth said. I have very little patience left for being anything other than calm. Eat your breakfast. London in December was grey and loud and smelled of coal smoke and the river and the particular urgency of a city that never quite stopped moving. Cecily had not been to London in 4 years. She had grown up making the journey twice a year, the spring season, the Christmas visit, and she had loved it the way you love something you have always had and therefore do not yet understand you could lose. The noise, the crowds, the sense of the world compressing into a few square miles of streets and drawing rooms and theaters. She looked out the carriage window and felt the city settle around her like a coat she had almost forgotten she owned. The Duke's London house was in Mayfair. Of course it was. It was tall and immaculate and understated in the way of houses that do not need to announce themselves. And when the door opened, it opened onto a hallway that smelled of beeswax and fresh flowers and the very particular silence of a well-run household. The Duke was waiting in the study. He looked, she thought, like a man who had not slept especially well in 10 days, which she found both concerning and, in a way she refused to examine, somewhat reassuring. He was in his shirt sleeves. He always seemed to end up in his shirt sleeves in her presence, she noted, which was either coincidence or something else entirely, and there were papers covering every surface of his desk in a manner that suggested organized urgency. He looked up when she came in. Miss Ashworth, he said. Your Grace, she looked at the papers, you have been busy. Sit down, he said, then catching himself, please. She sat. He remained standing, which meant he was unsettled, which meant whatever he had found was significant. She had learned to read him in the past weeks, the small adjustments, the tells he did not know he had. She catalogued this one and said nothing. I engaged a solicitor, he said. A man named Whitmore, recommended to me by a colleague in Parliament as someone with no existing connection to any of the estates involved. I gave him the 1816 ledger, a copy I made myself, and asked him to trace the discrepancy. And, Cecily said, it took him 6 days. He picked up a document from the desk, set it down, picked up another. What Grantham did was, it was not simple. He was careful. He had been doing it for a long time and he had developed methods. How long, she said. 15 years, possibly longer. He looked at her. Your father was not his only. There are 4 other families, the Holloways, the Price estate, 2 others I am still tracing. In each case, the method was the same: debts inflated after the original creditor died, terms altered in the paperwork, assets acquired at fractions of their value during settlements. He paused. He has been very wealthy for some years now. Nobody looked closely because the families who lost everything had no resources left to investigate, Cecily said. Yes. The word landed quietly between them. Cecily looked at the papers on his desk. 15 years, 4 families, her father dying believing himself a failure, believing he had ruined his daughter, lying awake in his last months with the weight of debts that had been constructed to destroy him. She had known something was wrong. She had known it for 2 years. But knowing and seeing it laid out in documents, in a stranger's handwriting, with dates and figures and the accumulated evidence of a decade and a half of deliberate theft, that was different. Her hands were folded in her lap. She kept them very still. Cecily, he said, very quietly. She looked up. His face was open, she thought, more open than she had ever seen it, all the careful management of it set aside, and what was underneath was something she had not quite prepared herself for. Not pity, something closer to pain. The specific pain of a person who has understood, too late and too completely, the weight of something they did not prevent. I am sorry, he said. I know it is insufficient. I know it does not. He stopped, started again. My father trusted Grantham. I inherited that trust without examining it. I signed documents I should have read. I took settlements at face value because they were presented to me by men I assumed were honest, and I was not paying attention, and people were harmed by that, and your family was harmed by that, and I cannot. He stopped again. He was not a man who found this easy. She could see that, the effort of it, the unfamiliarity of standing in front of someone and simply letting the weight of a thing be fully felt rather than managed. She thought it was probably the bravest thing she had seen him do. You did not defraud my father, she said. No, but I benefited from it, and I did not look. Most people do not look, she said. That is rather how these things persist. That is not an excuse. No, she agreed. It isn't, but it is a reason. He looked at her for a moment. Something shifted in his expression, not quite relief, something more complicated than relief. Grantham is being referred to the courts, he said. Whitmore believes the evidence is sufficient for prosecution. The other families are being contacted. He picked up another document. As for your family's specific situation, the North Fields cannot be returned. They were legally transferred and subsequently sold, and the current owners are not party to the fraud. But the difference in value, the sum that was fabricated, that can be restored. With interest, for the years it has been withheld. Cecily was very still. That is a considerable sum, she said carefully. Yes, he said, it is. You are not obligated. I am entirely obligated, he said, with a quiet firmness that closed the subject. It is not a gesture, it is a debt. It will be paid. She looked at him across the desk covered in papers, 10 days of work, a separate solicitor, documents traced through 15 years of fraud, and she felt something happening in her chest that she did not have an immediate name for. Something that had been held very tightly for a very long time beginning, cautiously and not without fear, to loosen. She had been managing for so long, calculating and careful and self-contained, because there had been no alternative, because the alternative was to fall apart, and there was no one to fall apart in front of and no time for it in any case. She was not going to fall apart now. But it was, she thought, a near thing. Thank you, she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of it. He nodded once. Then he seemed to remember something and reached for a smaller envelope on the corner of the desk. There is one more thing, he said. He held it out to her. She took it, opened it. It was a letter. Old paper, slightly yellowed, the handwriting immediately familiar, her father's cramped, anxious, beloved script. She looked up sharply. It was in Grantham's files, the Duke said. Whitmore found it. It appears Grantham kept it, perhaps as insurance against your father, or perhaps he simply never disposed of it. It is dated 3 months before your father died. Cecily looked down at the letter. It was addressed to the Duke of Ravenswood. To him, to Edmund, the current Duke, not his father. Her father had written to him directly, 3 months before his death, laying out his suspicions about the altered accounts, asking for the opportunity to review the original documents, asking, in the careful language of a man who knew he had very little leverage, for the chance to be heard. There was no record of a reply. Because Grantham had intercepted it, had kept it, had made sure it never arrived. Cecily read it twice. She read her father's handwriting, the loops of his G's, the way he crossed his T's, the specific rhythm of his sentences. And she thought about him sitting at his desk writing this letter, still fighting, still trying, still believing that if he could just get someone to listen. She folded it. She put it in her pocket next to the Duke's 3-line note. Her hands were not entirely steady anymore. He tried, she said, to herself as much as to anyone. He tried, the Duke confirmed, very quietly. They sat in silence for a moment that felt, to Cecily, like something being set down after a very long time of carrying it. Then she stood. She needed to stand. She needed to be upright for what came next, whatever that was. He stood too. They were on the same side of the desk, she realized. She had not noticed him move, but he was closer than he had been, near enough that she could see the tiredness around his eyes, the 10 days of it, and something else underneath the tiredness that she recognized because she felt it too. What happens now, she said, not quite a question. Now, he said, Grantham faces consequences. The other families are made whole as much as possible. Whitmore continues the investigation. He paused. And you? He stopped. And I, she said. He looked at her. That look, the one she had catalogued in kitchens and libraries and ballrooms, the one that went past the surface of things and took stock of what was underneath. You are no longer a governess who needs the position, he said. Not after the settlement. You will have not everything that was taken, but enough, more than enough. I see, she said. Which means, he said carefully, that whatever comes next it is your choice, entirely yours. I want to be very clear about that. She looked at him. You are being very careful, she said. I am trying to be, he said. I have not always been careful where you are concerned, and I am attempting to correct that. The chismeler, she said without thinking and then catching herself. The boots, the first weeks, the way you. I know, he said. I know what I did. I thought you were. He stopped. It doesn't matter what I thought. I was wrong and I was unkind and I am sorry for it. She looked at him for a long moment. This man who had stood in a kitchen at midnight and let a stranger take his bread, who had read his steward's reports and felt the weight of them and had not yet known what to do, who had danced with her in front of a room full of people and not looked away, who had spent 10 days in London with a solicitor and a stack of old ledgers looking. You looked, she said. He blinked. I beg your pardon. When it mattered, she said. You looked. You could have, when I showed you the ledger, you could have dismissed it. You could have decided it was too complicated or too inconvenient, or that a governess with a borrowed name had no standing to make such a claim. She paused. You didn't. Of course I didn't, he said, as though this were obvious. It is not of course, she said. It is not of course at all. Most men would have. He was quiet for a moment. I am not most men, he said, without arrogance, simply as a statement of fact. No, she said, you are not. Something moved between them, not quite a decision, not yet, but the space in which a decision might eventually be made. She was aware of it the way you are aware of weather changing, the pressure shifting before the storm arrives. She was not ready. She was not ready for this, not today, not with her father's letter in her pocket and the weight of 2 years still settling. He seemed to understand this, because he stepped back, not away, not in retreat, but in the particular manner of someone making room. "Stay in London for the week," he said. "Lady Pemworth's dressmaker will require at least that long, and Harriet is already planning to visit every bookshop in the city." A pause. "Let Whitmore finish. Let things settle." "And then," she said. "And then," he said, "we will see." It was not a declaration. It was not a promise of anything specific. It was simply space, time, the acknowledgement that something was there without demanding it be named before it was ready. She could work with that. She had been working with considerably less for 2 years. "Very well," she said, "a week." She moved toward the door, stopped. "Your Grace," she said without turning around. "Yes." "The boots," she said. "I want you to know that I clean them without complaint, every time." A pause. "I know," he said. There was something in his voice she had not heard before, something rueful and warm and just slightly undone. "I want you to know," she continued, "that I also considered throwing them out the window." A longer pause. "I think," he said, "that would have been entirely fair." She left. In the hallway outside, she stood for a moment with her hand flat against the wall and her father's letter in her pocket, and the particular feeling of a world that was, after a very long time, beginning to arrange itself differently. Not yet right, not yet whole, but beginning. That, she thought, was enough for today. She was halfway up the stairs when she heard it. A sound from behind the closed study door, not words, not movement. Just the quiet, specific exhale of a man alone in a room, finally letting something go. She did not stop. But she was smiling when she reached the top of the stairs. Just slightly, just for a moment. Then she went to find Harriet, who was almost certainly already making a list of bookshops, and she got on with the afternoon. The week in London passed quietly. Too quietly, as it turned out. Cecily would understand this later, that the quiet was not peace but accumulation, the particular stillness of water before it moves very fast in a direction you did not expect. But for 7 days, she did not know that yet. Harriet found 6 bookshops. She approached the project with the methodical intensity she brought to everything she cared about, producing a handwritten list on the second morning with addresses, hours of operation and brief annotations. Good natural history section. Smells of cats but has excellent maps asterisk. The man at the counter is rude but has first editions. That suggested she had done considerable advanced research through methods Cecily chose not to examine. They visited all 6. Cecily bought 2 books she could not quite afford and did not regret it. Harriet bought 7 and was not apologetic about any of them. Lady Pemworth visited her dressmaker on 3 consecutive afternoons, emerging each time with the satisfied expression of a woman who has been measured correctly and intends to be comfortable about it. The Duke joined them for dinner twice. He was different in London. Still himself, still precise and contained, but there was something slightly looser about him in his own house, some small degree of the performance set aside. He argued with Lady Pemworth about a novel she had read and he had not, and lost the argument gracefully. He listened to Harriet's account of the bookshops with genuine attention and borrowed one of her purchases with her permission. He spoke to Cecily about ordinary things, the weather, a lecture at the Royal Institution, whether she had seen the exhibition at Somerset House. He did not mention Grantham. He did not mention the settlement. He did not mention what had passed between them in the study. He was, she realized, giving her room, keeping his word about that. She was not sure whether she found it considerate or maddening, possibly both. She was becoming accustomed to that particular combination where he was concerned. On the sixth evening, Lady Pemworth fell asleep early, and Harriet was put to bed with her books, and Cecily found herself alone in the Duke's drawing room with a cup of tea and a fire, and the quiet that settled over a house when its youngest inhabitant had finally stopped moving. She was reading, or attempting to read, which was not quite the same thing when he came in. He stopped when he saw her. "I thought you had retired." "Not yet," she looked up. "Do you want me to go?" "No," he said without hesitation, and sat in the chair across from hers. They sat in companionable quiet for a while. The fire, the clock, the sound of London outside, muffled by glass and distance but present, the city always present. "My mother will be in London next week," he said at length. Cecily turned a page she had not read. "I see. She will have heard about the ball, about the dance." He was looking at the fire. "She will have things to say." "I imagine she will," Cecily said. "She seems like a woman who generally does." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. "She is." A pause. "She is also not wrong in the way she sees the world. She wants what is best for this family and this estate, and she has spent a great deal of energy ensuring it, and by the lights of everything she was taught and everything she believes, a woman in your situation is not suitable," Cecily said, evenly. "Is complicated," he said, "which is not the same thing, though she may not currently be making that distinction." She looked at him. "And you, are you making the distinction?" He met her eyes. "I am sitting in my drawing room at 10 o'clock in the evening talking to you, which I think answers that question." She looked back at her book. "It answers a question," she said, "not necessarily that one." A pause. "You are difficult," he said, not unkindly. "You are evasive," she returned. "We are perhaps well matched in that respect." Something warm moved through his expression, brief, unguarded, gone before she could be certain she had seen it. "Perhaps," he said. They sat until the fire burned low. Then she said good night and went to bed, and she lay in the dark for a while thinking about the word asterisk perhaps and what it contained and what it might, given sufficient time and a reasonable amount of good faith, eventually become. They returned to the county on Thursday. On Friday, Whitmore's full report arrived at Ravenswood. On Saturday, the Dowager Duchess arrived as well. Cecily did not know about the Dowager's arrival until Sunday. She heard it from Harriet, who heard it from the upstairs maid, who had heard it from the Ravenswood housekeeper at the market, which was the route by which most significant information traveled in a small county. "Uncle Edmund's mother is at the manor," Harriet announced, settling into her chair for the morning lesson with the air of someone delivering intelligence. "She arrived with 3 carriages and a great deal of luggage. Mrs. Prewitt says she looks like she is staying." Cecily opened the arithmetic book. "That is entirely her son's business." "Mrs. Prewitt says she was asking questions about Lady Pemworth's household," Harriet said. Cecily was quiet for a moment. "What kind of questions?" she said. "About the governess." Harriet looked at her steadily. "About you." She had known it was coming. She had known it since the ball, since the Dowager's warm, careful smile and the reference to her father's unfortunate circumstances. She had known it since London, since the Duke had said she will have things to say and looked into the fire. Knowing it was coming did not, as it turned out, make it easier. It came on Tuesday. Not from the Dowager directly. She was cleverer than that, Cecily thought. It came through channels. Through the particular channels that a woman of the Dowager's experience knew how to use without leaving fingerprints. The first was Mrs. Alderton, wife of the county magistrate, who stopped Cecily in the village on Tuesday morning with the specific expression of a woman performing reluctance. "My dear miss," she began. A pause. "I confess I am not certain what to call you. I had heard Miss Clare, but I understand that is not your name. Miss Ashworth, Cecily said. It has always been Miss Ashworth. Yes. Mrs. Alderton's eyes were kind in the way of people who are doing something unkind and need to feel differently about it. I hope you will not think me impertinent, but there has been some talk, my dear, about the ball. She lowered her voice, as though the street might be listening, the nature of your position in Lady Pemworth's household and your connection, shall we say, to the Duke. I am Lady Pemworth's companion, Cecily said. I have no connection to the Duke beyond the fact that he is her nephew. Of course. Mrs. Alderton patted her hand. I only mention it because, well, people do talk, and a young woman in your situation must be especially careful of appearances, mustn't she? Given your family's history. Another pat. I'm sure you understand. Cecily smiled. It cost her the same thing the dowager's smile had cost her at the ball. Thank you for your concern, she said. She walked back to Lady Pemworth's house and said nothing to anyone. The second came on Wednesday. A note delivered to the house. No signature, no return address. 3 lines in an educated hand that she did not recognize. You would do well to consider what you owe to those who have shown you kindness, and whether pursuing an ambition above your current station serves anyone's interest but your own. A woman of understanding knows when to step aside gracefully. She burned it in the parlor fireplace. She stood and watched it turn to ash, and she was, for a moment, so angry she could not speak. Not at the note. The note was cowardly and small, and she had dealt with worse. She was angry at the word asterisk gracefully asterisk, at the idea that grace meant diminishment, that a woman stepped aside gracefully when she was pushed. She had been stepping aside for 3 years. She was very tired of the stepping. The third came on Thursday, and it was not subtle. The Ravenswood housekeeper appeared at Lady Pemworth's door, not the Duke's regular messenger, not a footman, but Mrs. Prewitt herself, which meant it was personal, with a letter addressed to Cecily in the dowager's handwriting. Lady Pemworth intercepted it. She was still holding it unopened when Cecily came downstairs. Sit down, Lady Pemworth said. Cecily sat. Lady Pemworth looked at the letter in her hand, then at Cecily. Her sharp blue eyes were, for once, not sharp. They were something older and more complicated than sharpness. She has also written to me, the old woman said, my sister-in-law. Cecily waited. She has informed me that she is aware of the irregularities in your employment here, that you misrepresented your name, that you used your access to the Ravenswood Library for purposes beyond Harriet's education. She paused. She suggests that I have been deceived by a woman of questionable character, and that continuing your employment reflects poorly on this household. The words landed one by one. Cecily felt each of them. She also suggests, Lady Pemworth continued in the same even tone, that your presence is causing complications for Edmund, in terms of his prospects, his obligations to the family name. She set the letter on the table. She has written to 3 other households in the county as well. I have been told this by Mrs. Fenwick, who is a gossip but an accurate one. Cecily was quiet. She is thorough, she said finally. She is, Lady Pemworth agreed. She always has been. She looked at Cecily with those complicated eyes. What would you like to do? What do you mean? I mean precisely what I said. What would you like to do? The old woman folded her hands in her lap. I am not asking what is sensible or what is expected or what a woman in your position ought to do. I am asking what you want. Cecily looked at her hands. She thought about the note in the fireplace. She thought about Mrs. Alderton's kind, unkind eyes. She thought about 3 years of managing and calculating and making herself smaller. She thought about the Duke in the kitchen at midnight, saying take what you need in a voice that had expected nothing in return. "I don't want to leave," she said. "Then don't," Lady Pemworth said simply. "It will cause him difficulty. He is a grown man and a duke, and he can manage his own difficulty." Lady Pemworth picked up her embroidery with the decisiveness of someone closing one topic and opening another. "What I will not have in my house is a woman running away from something she has every right to stand in front of." Cecily looked at her. "You knew," she said. "You knew who I was from the beginning." Lady Pemworth did not look up from her embroidery. "I knew your mother," she said. "You have her eyes and her chin and a great deal of her stubbornness. I recognized you the moment you walked through my door." A pause. "I also needed a companion, and you needed a position, and I have lived long enough to know that things work themselves out if you give them sufficient room." She said it the way she said most things, as simple fact, without sentimentality, without any particular expectation of being thanked. Cecily looked at the old woman's bent head, the silver hair, the steady hands. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," Lady Pemworth said. "When?" The letter from the Duke arrived an hour later. It was longer than 3 lines this time. "I am aware of what my mother has done. I am aware of the letters and I am aware of the talk, and I need you to know that none of it has my sanction, and I am dealing with it. I would come to you directly, but I have been advised, by Whitmore, and by my own better judgment, that appearing at Lady Pemworth's door today would add fuel to precisely the fire we are both trying to manage. I need to ask you to wait. I know I am asking a great deal. I know you have been waiting for 3 years already, and I am asking for more of it, and I am aware of the unfairness of that. But I am also asking you not to leave. Whatever my mother has said or done or arranged, please do not leave." The asterisk. She read it twice. Then she put it in her pocket with the others, his first note, her father's letter, the small paper archive of the past months, the evidence that things had happened and mattered and could not be untaken. She went upstairs and sat on the edge of her bed and was honest with herself, which was something she tried to do regularly and found consistently uncomfortable. She was frightened. Not of the dowager, not of the talk, not of the county's opinion. She had survived worse than all of those, and she would survive them again. She was frightened of the other thing, the thing she had been not looking at since a kitchen at midnight, since a library in the afternoon, since a ballroom and a man who had said, "I don't particularly care about his mother watching," and had meant it. She was frightened of wanting something. She had spent 3 years not wanting things, because wanting things when you had nothing was a particular kind of cruelty you learned to avoid. You kept your head down and you managed, and you did not look at what you could not have. She was looking now. She had been looking for some time. And that was terrifying, and she sat with it for a while, the fear of it, the specific texture of it. And then she got up and washed her face and went downstairs. Harriet was at the parlor table with her arithmetic, hitting the same wrong answer she always hit on the 3rd problem and frowning at the page. Cecily sat across from her. "Show me where you went wrong," she said. Harriet showed her. They worked through it together. The afternoon passed. Cecily did not leave. That evening in the village, the story began to circulate. Not the true story, not Grantham, not the ledgers, not 15 years of fraud. The other story, the easier one, the one that required no complicated financial records and no dead men's letters and no understanding of estate law. The story was this. The late Baron Ashworth's disgraced daughter had deceived her way into a respectable household under a false name, had used her access to pursue the Duke of Ravenswood, and had set her cap at him with the calculated ambition of a woman who had nothing to lose and everything to gain. It moved fast, as these stories did. By Friday it had reached 3 neighboring counties. By Saturday, it had acquired details that Cecily had never done and qualities she did not possess, and a coldness of motive that made her sound like a character in a cautionary tale. By Sunday, doors that had been cautiously open were closed. An invitation to a tea that had been extended was quietly withdrawn. The woman who ran the lending library greeted her with a new distance. In church, the pew that had been next to hers was chosen last. She bore it. She walked through it with her chin level and her expression neutral, and she bore it. But on Sunday evening she sat in the library, and she allowed herself, briefly and in private, to feel the full weight of it, the injustice, the smallness, the old familiar sensation of being seen as only what other people needed her to be. She was so tired. She was so tired of it. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes and breathed and thought, "This is the worst of it. This is the bottom. Things do not go further down than this." She was wrong. Monday morning, a knock at Lady Pemworth's door. Not a footman, not a messenger. The Duke's mother. In person, alone, dressed impeccably as always, that warm, careful smile arranged precisely in place. Lady Pemworth received her in the front parlor with the cool cordiality of a woman who had been managing difficult relatives for 60 years and had developed considerable expertise. Cecily was not in the room. She was upstairs with Harriet, who was reading and did not know what was happening below. She heard the voices, not words, but the tones. Lady Pemworth steady, the dowagers measured, going on for some time. Then quiet. Then Lady Pemworth's footsteps on the stairs, slower than usual, heavier, the steps of someone carrying something. She appeared in the doorway of Harriet's room. "Harriet," she said, "go and ask cook for some biscuits." Harriet went without question. She had learned in the months with Lady Pemworth to read that particular tone. The old woman came in and sat down, and looked at Cecily with those complicated eyes. "She has spoken to Whitmore," Lady Pemworth said. Cecily went cold. She has suggested to him that his continued professional engagement with Edmund might be jeopardized if the investigation into Grantham proceeds in a manner that reflects poorly on the Ravenswood estate's management, that any implication that Edmund failed in his oversight duties could damage the family's reputation. A pause. "She is asking Whitmore to moderate his findings. She is asking him to protect Grantham," Cecily said. "She is protecting her son," Lady Pemworth said quietly, "in the only way she knows how, which is to remove anything that makes him look as though he failed. She does not understand." She stopped. "She is not a wicked woman, Cecily. She is a frightened one. She has worked very hard for a very long time to protect something she loves, and she sees you as a threat to it, and she is using every tool she has." "And Whitmore," Cecily said. Her voice was very steady. She was using the steadiness like scaffolding. "Will he listen to her?" A pause that told her everything. "He has not yet decided," Lady Pemworth said. Cecily went to the window. Outside, the December garden, the bare trees, the sky the color of old pewter. If Whitmore moderated his findings, if the investigation was softened, if the evidence was made less clear, Grantham would face lesser charges, lesser consequences. The other families, the Holloways, the Prices, the ones she had not yet met but who had lost what her family had lost, they would receive less, or nothing. And it would be over. The Duke would make some restitution to her privately, quietly, in a way that could be dismissed as charity rather than justice. The story would be managed. The dowager would get what she wanted. Everyone would be very comfortable about it, except the people who had lost fields and livelihoods and fathers, who had died believing they were failures. She turned from the window. "I need to go to Ravenswood," she said. Lady Pemworth looked at her. "He asked you to wait," she said, "not as a prohibition, as a fact." "I know," Cecily said. "I cannot." The old woman studied her for a long moment. Then she nodded once, with the air of someone who has been waiting for a decision and is satisfied it has arrived. "The carriage will be ready in half an hour," she said. She had never come to Ravenswood through the front door. She had come through the dark, through the kitchen, through the library, always the side of the house, the unannounced entrance, the back way in. She had always been arriving as something other than herself. She stood now at the front door in the December afternoon and knocked. The footman who opened it knew her. He had seen her at Lady Pemworth's table a dozen times. He showed her in without hesitation. "His Grace is in the study," he said, "with the Dowager." "I know," Cecily said. "Please tell him Miss Ashworth is here." She waited in the entrance hall. She did not wait long. He came out of the study and closed the door behind him and looked at her across the hall with an expression she could not quite read, not surprise, not alarm, but something complicated moving underneath the surface. "Cecily," he said. She had been composing sentences in the carriage. Careful, measured sentences about Whitmore and the investigation and what his mother was doing and what it meant for the other families. Reasonable sentences, persuasive ones. Standing in front of him, she found she had lost interest in the careful sentences. "She is going to protect Grantham," she said. "To protect you, or what she thinks protects you. And Whitmore may listen to her, and if he does, 4 families get nothing, and a man who has been stealing from people for 15 years faces no real consequence, and She stopped. He was very still. "I know," he said. "You know. I spoke to Whitmore this morning." His voice was quiet. "Before my mother arrived, I had anticipated this or something like it." She stared at him. "You anticipated it." "I know my mother," he said. "I knew that when she understood the full scope of what Whitmore had found, what it implied about my management of the estate, my oversight of Grantham, I knew she would try to contain it." "And," Cecily said, "and I told Whitmore that his instructions come from me, not from the Dowager Duchess, and that he is to proceed with the full findings, and that if anyone attempts to interfere with that, I am to be informed immediately." A pause. "He told me," the Duke said quietly, "approximately an hour ago when she paid him her visit." Cecily looked at him. "She doesn't know that," she said slowly. "No. She thinks she has." "Yes. And you let her. You let her come here believing she had succeeded." "I wanted to speak to her first," he said. "I wanted to. She is my mother, Cecily. She has done wrong, and I am not going to protect her from the consequences of that, but I wanted to speak to her myself before it became—" He stopped. "Before it became something else." She looked at him standing in the entrance hall of his own house, coat still on from his morning out, and she thought about what it cost him. Not the legal complexity, not the estate management, but the human cost of it, the specific weight of choosing justice over the person who loved you most wrongly. "Your Grace," she said. "Edmund," he said. "I think at this point, Edmund." "Edmund?" It was strange in her mouth, true and strange. "What are you going to say to her?" He was quiet for a moment. "The truth," he said, "which is that Grantham will be prosecuted, the findings will stand, and the affected families will receive full restitution." A pause. "And that her interference, the letters, the talk, what she has done to your reputation in this county, that also has to be addressed." "She will not forgive you," Cecily said. "She will," he said. "Eventually, she always does." He looked at her steadily. "She loves me. She has simply decided that love means controlling everything around me, and I have allowed it for too long, and that has to change." Cecily thought about what it had taken her to come to the front door today, to knock at the front door and give her real name and stand in the hall and wait. She thought it probably cost him something similar, Different shape, same weight. Go speak to her, she said. He nodded, then he paused. You came, he said, not quite a question. I came, she said. You could have sent a note. I could have, she agreed. He looked at her for a moment, that look, the one she had catalogued in kitchens and libraries and ballrooms, the one that went past the surface. Then he went back into the study. She heard voices begin, his, low and steady, and then his mother's, rising. She did not stay to listen. She walked back out into the December afternoon and got into Lady Pemworth's carriage and sat with her hands folded and looked out the window at the bare trees. She had not said what she came to say. She had not had to. That was either very good or very complicated. She suspected, knowing him, that it was both. The week that followed was the quietest Cecily had ever known. Not peaceful, not the quiet of things resolved or settled or put to rest, the quiet of things held in suspension, the moment between lightning and thunder when the air itself seems to be deciding something. She waited. She had told him she was tired of waiting, and then she had done it anyway, because some things could not be rushed without being broken, and she had come too far to break this now. She taught Harriet. She read in the evenings. She walked in the mornings through the December lanes with frost on the hedgerows and her breath clouding in the cold air, and she thought about her father's letter and the ledgers and the north fields, and she thought about kitchens and libraries and ballrooms, and she thought about a man standing in an entrance hall saying *Edmund as though it were an offering. She did not hear from him. On the fourth day, she began to wonder if she had miscalculated. On the fifth day, Lady Pemworth told her, with studied casualness, that the Dowager Duchess had departed Ravenswood. Gone back to London? Cecily asked. Bath, Lady Pemworth said. She has a house there. She goes when she needs to reconsider things. A pause. She has always gone to Bath to reconsider things. She went there after Edmund's father died. She went there when Edmund refused to sell the north quarter of the estate 3 years ago. She picked up her embroidery. She always comes back. And in the meantime, Cecily said. In the meantime, Lady Pemworth said, life continues. Whitmore's full report was submitted to the courts on the 6th day. Cecily learned this not from the Duke but from Whitmore himself, who appeared at Lady Pemworth's door on a gray Thursday morning with his hat in his hands, and the careful expression of a man who understood that he was delivering something that was simultaneously very good news and the end of a very long road. The findings were complete. Grantham had been defrauding estate clients for 17 years, 2 years longer than they had initially believed. 5 families in all, including the Ashworths. The documentation was extensive and unambiguous. Criminal proceedings would follow. Civil restitution was being arranged simultaneously, family by family, through separate counsel. And the Ashworth settlement specifically, Cecily said. Whitmore opened his case and produced a document. She read it. She read it again. It was more than she had calculated. The original inflated sum, plus interest for the years since her father's death, plus a separate accounting for what she could only describe as consequential losses. The income she had not earned, the opportunities she had not had, the season she had not attended, the years she had spent managing instead of living. Someone had calculated all of it, in careful columns, to the penny. She knew whose handwriting it was. The Duke arranged this, she said. He provided the parameters, Whitmore said, in the tone of a man choosing his words carefully. He was very specific about what should be included. She set the document down, picked it up again, set it down. Tell him, she said, and then stopped, because she did not know how to finish that sentence with a lawyer present. I will convey that you have received the documentation, Whitmore said tactfully. Yes, she said, do that. She went to the tenants that afternoon. Not to deliver news. Whitmore's office would handle the formal notifications for the other families. She went because she needed to do something with her hands, something real and physical, and because the Mercer cottage was 4 miles and a long, cold walk, and she needed 4 miles and a long, cold walk. She brought bread, old habit. Mrs. Mercer opened the door and looked at her and looked at the bread and said, "The Duke's man came this morning." "I know," Cecily said. "He said," Mrs. Mercer stopped. She was a practical woman, not given to sentiment. She had weathered the hard winter with the focused stoicism of someone who had weathered hard winters before. But she stopped in her own doorway and pressed her lips together for a moment in the manner of someone managing something too large for ordinary expression. "Yes," Cecily said gently, "I know." Mrs. Mercer looked at her. "You did this." "He did this," Cecily said. "I only showed him where to look." The woman looked at her for a long moment. Then she took the bread with both hands and said, "Come in, it's cold." Cecily came in. She stayed for an hour. She drank bad tea and listened to the youngest Mercer child, who was recovered and thriving and had opinions about everything, and she sat in the warmth of a small cottage that smelled of wood smoke and cabbage soup and thought, This is what the ledgers were actually about, not the numbers. This. She walked the 4 miles back in the early dark, and she was not tired at all. He came on the 7th day. Not to Lady Pemworth's house, not in a carriage with a footman and a calling card and the formal architecture of a visit. He came on foot, in the morning, to the lane behind Lady Pemworth's garden, where he apparently knew from Harriet, she suspected, who knew everything, that Cecily walked on weekday mornings between 8 and 9. She turned a corner in the lane, and he was simply there. Coat, no hat, his dark hair slightly disordered by the wind. He looked like a man who had made a decision, and then walked 4 miles on the strength of it. She stopped. He stopped. They stood in the December lane, with frost on the hedgerows and their breath clouding in the cold air, and looked at each other. "You came on foot," she said. "I did. It is very cold." "It is," he agreed. "I did not particularly notice." She looked at him, this man, this specific complicated man who had stood in a kitchen at midnight and in a library in the afternoon, and in an entrance hall in December, and had chosen, each time, to keep looking, who had sat with a solicitor for 10 days and calculated consequential losses to the penny, who had spoken the truth to his mother and let her go to Bath to reconsider it. "How is she?" Cecily asked. "Your mother?" He blinked. It was clearly not what he had expected. "She is in Bath," he said. She will be all right. She is angry with me, which is familiar, and she is reconsidering things, which is also familiar, and she will come back in the spring and we will manage it." "She loves you," Cecily said. "Yes," he said, "badly sometimes, but yes." "Most people love badly sometimes," she said. He looked at her. Something moved across his face, that undone quality she had seen in London, the performance fully absent, just the man. "I owe you a great many things," he said. "An apology for the boots, an apology for not reading the documents I should have read 15 years ago, an apology for every week you spent in this county managing what my mother—" He stopped. "There is quite a long list." "There is," she agreed. "I have been composing it," he said. "In some detail, it covers approximately." "Edmund," she said. He stopped. "I don't want the list," she said. He looked at her. "The apologies are noted," she said, "and accepted. The consequences have been faced. The accounts," she thought of Whitmore's document, the careful columns, the penny-perfect accounting, "are settled." She looked at him steadily. "I don't want to live in the accounting anymore. I have been living in the accounting for 3 years and I am very tired of it." "What do you want?" he said, very quietly. She looked at the lane. The frost, the bare hedgerows, the gray December sky. She thought about her mother's green dress and the mended cuff. She thought about Lady Pemworth saying win asterisk. She thought about Harriet's smile on the second day, the one that had transformed her entirely. She thought about a man who had looked at her in a dark kitchen and not looked away since. I want, she said carefully, to stop managing and start living. I want Harriet to have someone who does not leave. I want to visit the Mercer cottage because I choose to, not because I have no other option. I want, she stopped. Yes, he said. She looked at him. I want to not be frightened of wanting things, she said. That is what I want. He crossed the distance between them. Not quickly. He moved the way he always moved, with that economy, nothing wasted, but he crossed it. He was close enough now that she could see the tiredness still around his eyes, and underneath it, something that was not tiredness at all. Something that had been there in kitchens and libraries and drawing rooms, and was simply, finally, not being managed. I should like, he said very carefully, to give you cause to want things, if you will allow it. She looked at him for a moment that felt very long and very quiet. You should know, she said, that I will be very difficult about it. I know, he said, the corner of his mouth moved. I find I am looking forward to it. And I will not be managed. I would not attempt it. And if you are ever unkind, you will throw my boots out the window, he said. I believe we established this. She looked at him. He looked at her. In the December lane with the frost and the cold air and the whole long, complicated year behind them and whatever came next ahead. Ask me properly, she said. I have waited long enough. He did. She said yes. And then she said, you are going to have to apologize to Mrs. Alderton. He blinked. I beg your pardon. In the village. She was very unkind to me on behalf of your mother, and she has a great many friends. And if we are to live in this county peaceably, she needs to understand that what she said was Cecily, entirely unacceptable, and you are in the best position too. Cecily. She stopped. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen before, not the polished duke, not the careful man, not the studied neutrality. Something warm and entirely unguarded and just slightly, helplessly amused. Yes, he said, I will speak to Mrs. Alderton. She nodded, good. Is there anyone else? I have a list, she said. He laughed. She had not heard him laugh before, not fully, not unmanaged. It transformed him entirely, the way Harriet's smile had on the second day. And she stood in the lane and looked at this person she was apparently going to build a life with and felt something settle in her chest that had not been settled in a very long time. Come, she said, you can walk me back. Lady Pemworth will want to know and she will be insufferable about it, and I find I do not mind at all. He fell into step beside her. They walked. The frost glittered on the hedgerows. The lane curved toward the house. Above them the December sky was doing something complicated with the light, the clouds shifting, a pale winter sun beginning to find its way through. The kitchen, he said after a moment. What about it? That night, you could have run when you heard me on the stairs. I could have, she agreed. Why didn't you? She considered this for a few steps. I was tired of running, she said, and I had bread to carry. She glanced at him. Also, you were between me and the door. Practical, he said. Always, she said. He was quiet for a moment. I am glad, he said, very simply, that you didn't run. She looked ahead at the lane, at the pale winter light on the frozen ground, at the turning that led to Lady Pemworth's house and the warm kitchen and Harriet with her books and all of it, the ordinary beautiful entirety of it, waiting. So am I, she said. They turned the corner. 1 year later, The kitchen at Ravenswood Manor was never empty before midnight. There were always coals left glowing in the hearth, always the smell of something good from the day's cooking hanging in the warm air, always the soft creak of the old house settling into itself. The Duchess of Ravenswood knew this. She had made a point of knowing it. She came down the back stairs at 11:30, as she sometimes did when the house was quiet and her mind was not, in her dressing gown with her hair loose and her feet in the old slippers that Edmund had twice suggested replacing, and that she had twice declined to replace on the grounds that they were comfortable, and she was the Duchess, and she would wear what she liked. This was, she had discovered, one of the genuine advantages of the position. The kitchen was warm and lamplit and smelled of the evening's bread, and the remains of the herb bundles hung to dry above the window, and she stood in the doorway for a moment, simply breathing it in. Then she crossed to the larder, found the cold chicken she had been thinking about since approximately 9 o'clock, located the good bread and the mustard, and sat down at the kitchen table to construct what she privately considered an excellent midnight meal. She was halfway through it when she heard the stairs. He appeared in the doorway in his shirt sleeves. He was always in his shirt sleeves, she had noted, when encountered unexpectedly in this kitchen, as though the room had some particular power to undo the formality of him, with his dark hair disordered and the expression of a man who had woken, found the other side of the bed empty, and followed the most logical conclusion. He looked at her. He looked at the chicken. He looked at the bread. Again, he said. "I was hungry," she said. "You are always hungry at midnight." "I am a woman of regular habits," she said. "You knew this when you married me." He came into the kitchen. He sat down across from her. He reached across the table and broke off a piece of her bread without asking, which she allowed because she was in a good mood, and also because he had learned, over the course of a year, that there were certain liberties she would permit and certain ones she would not, and he had become very accurate at distinguishing between them. "You couldn't sleep," he said, not a question. "I was thinking." "About what?" She looked around the kitchen, the warm hearth, the lamp, the herbs drying above the window, the house quiet and large and entirely, improbably hers. "The Holloway family," she said. "Mrs. Holloway wrote to me last week. Her eldest son has taken on a new tenancy, a good one, she says. They are managing." He was quiet for a moment. "Good." "And the prices? Old William's granddaughter came to see me on Tuesday. She wanted to thank me, which was very unnecessary, and I told her so, which made her laugh, which I found I did not mind. She picked up her bread. I was thinking about all of them, about where they are now versus a year ago." She paused. "About where I am now versus a year ago." He looked at her across the kitchen table at 11:30 at night, in the particular way he had looked at her since a dark kitchen and a bag of stolen bread and the beginning of everything. "And," he said. "And I find," she said, "that I am satisfied." He considered this, just satisfied. "Exceedingly satisfied," she said, "unreasonably satisfied. Satisfied in a manner I did not believe available to me approximately 14 months ago." She looked at him. "Will that do?" Something warm moved through his expression, unguarded, unhurried, entirely his. "It will do," he said. They sat in the warm kitchen in the quiet of the house. Outside, the December wind was up, moving through the trees along the drive, rattling the old window above the larder that still, after 3 requests to the carpenter, had not been properly fixed. The coals shifted in the hearth. Somewhere upstairs Harriet was asleep surrounded by her books, and Lady Pemworth was asleep in the east guest room where she now spent half her time, and the house was full in the way a house is full when the right people are in it. "She is coming back," he said. "My mother after Christmas." "I know," Cecily said. "She wrote to me," she said. He paused. "She said she would like to call on you formally if you are willing." Cecily ate her chicken. She thought about the dowager's warm, careful smile, and the letters and the talk and the word asterisk gracefully asterisk, and what it had cost her, that winter, to remain standing in front of it all. She also thought about a woman in Bath, reconsidering things. A woman who loved her son badly and was, perhaps, learning to love him better. Most people loved badly sometimes. "Tell her she is welcome," she said. "Tell her to come for tea." He looked at her. "You are more generous than I am," he said. "I know," she said. "It is one of my many fine qualities." She pushed the plate toward him. "Eat something. You came all the way down here." He took a piece of chicken. They sat. The clock on the kitchen wall moved toward midnight. The wind settled. The coals glowed. After a while he said, "Cecily, you are stealing my kitchen again." She looked up. He was watching her with that expression, the warm, unguarded one, the one that had no performance in it, that was just him, just this. "This kitchen," she said, "belongs to me, as you will recall." She held his gaze. "I married into it quite specifically." "You married into considerably more than the kitchen." "Yes," she said, "but the kitchen was the beginning." He looked at her for a long moment across the table, across the year, across all of it. "It was," he said. She smiled. It was not the careful smile she had worn in ballrooms and parlors and Lady Pemworth's drawing room, the one that cost something. It was the other one, the one that cost nothing at all because there was no one here to perform it for, only him, only this, only the warm kitchen and the good bread and the extraordinary ordinary fact of being home. "Come," she said, "it's late." She stood, she picked up the lamp. At the kitchen door she stopped. She turned back. He was still sitting at the table, watching her, and his expression was the one she had catalogued across 100 moments, kitchens and libraries and ballrooms and December lanes, and would spend the rest of her life adding to, she thought. New rooms, new moments, the catalogue always growing. "Edmund," she said. "Yes." "Thank you for coming down." "You were gone," he said simply. "Of course I came." She stood in the kitchen doorway in her old slippers with the lamp in her hand, and looked at this man who had always, when it mattered, come, who had come to the library and the ball and the study in London and the lane in December, and had always, each time, kept looking. She thought she would probably never stop being grateful for that. She thought she would probably never tell him, not directly, not in so many words, because she was herself and some things were better shown than said. But she thought it. "Good night," she said. "Good night," he said. She went up the stairs. He followed, as he always did, as she had learned she could rely on him to do. The kitchen settled into its midnight quiet behind them, warm and lamp-dark, smelling of bread and herbs and the good remains of an ordinary evening. Outside the stars. Inside the house breathing. Everything at last, exactly as it should be. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.